Hi all, this is Steph Giordano with Human Services Research Institute, and welcome to the third refresher training module for the NCI AD 2018-19 data collection cycle. Here we're going to start to look at the consumer survey, the face-to-face portion of the survey, and just really do a brief review of some updates and changes to the survey itself, and we'll talk about a few questions where people sometimes get a bit stuck. So just to do a really quick recap on some guidelines for conducting the consumer survey. First, we always read questions as they are written and then reword or rephrase if the person needs help with understanding what's being asked. Throughout the survey, we do offer some rephrasings, but you are absolutely welcome to use your own rephrasings if you have a way of explaining the question that the person may better understand. You do want to just make sure that you keep the intent of the question if you use your own rephrasings. You can reference the surveyor handbook for additional rephrasings, rewording, definitions, examples, and the intent of questions. If you do not yet have that surveyor handbook for 2018-19, you can get in touch with your coordinator who can send that over to you. If a person responds to a question in a way that does not clearly fit into one of our predetermined response options, we do want you to do some following up and probing to determine the most appropriate response. We do not want you to assume that you know what their answer means as it relates to one of our response options. Throughout the survey, we do have those more objective questions that can be answered by a proxy respondent if needed. Those questions are denoted with the gray proxy box. So as you go through the full consumer survey, the person can absolutely have help from family members, staff, or somebody else who knows the person well in answering those questions where, again, we have that gray proxy box. We'll talk a little bit later in the next module about when it's appropriate to use a proxy respondent for the full survey and who can serve as a proxy, but just keep in mind that it's absolutely okay to conduct the full survey with the individual and have them have help from others if they need to on those selected questions. Finally, you do have that don't know and unclear response options if the person is unable to understand questions, if you cannot do a follow-up in which you can really have the person understand what's being asked, or when you just don't understand how the person's response would fit into one of our categories. You can always use those don't know, unclear responses if it's absolutely needed. So now we're going to jump into the actual consumer survey and again look at some updates to the survey itself and some of those kind of sticky questions. Alright, so the consumer survey starts out with those questions about the person's home and relationships. These, if you remember, are those questions that are used to determine whether the individual is going to be able to move on with the full survey. They may need some help as you go through the full survey, that's okay. But whether they'll be able to answer at least some of your questions, or if you'll have to jump over to the proxy version of the survey. Again, we'll go a little more in depth about when it's appropriate to use a proxy respondent in a later module. For now, let's just take a look at some of these questions here. So we start out with that question 1, how long have you lived here? I just want to remind you all that this is not a question where we need an absolutely accurate number of years or months that the person's lived in their current home. It's really just to start the person thinking about where they live and kind of introduce them to answering some of these questions. Questions 4 and 5, I just want to point out, these are those questions, would you prefer to live somewhere else, and where would you prefer to live? For both of these, we're really not trying to get at geography, so maybe the person says that they would prefer to live in a warmer climate. What we're really looking for here is the type of home where they'd want to live. The only sort of caveat here is if the person says that they want to move to be closer or live with family who maybe live in another state or in another climate because where they live now affects their health in a negative way, that's okay. We would count that as a yes. Otherwise, we're really strictly looking for the type of home people are would like to live in. And starting with question 6, we have questions about relationships. So do you have friends or family who do not live with you, who are involved in your life? Really, really important here that you include that who do not live with you, if the person is living with family or maybe roommates who they consider friends. Same goes for this question 7. Are you able to see or talk to your friends and family who do not live with you when you want to? And then we have that proxy determination. So is the person receiving services able to respond to the above questions? So again, if the person was able to answer some of these questions in a valid, reliable way, you would check off yes and go on with the rest of the full survey. Again, knowing that it is absolutely okay if the person might just need help being reminded of some of the responses, but really they'll be able to answer at least some of the questions going forward. The person was really not able to answer any of these questions and sort of struggled getting through them, that's when we would use that no response and then jump over to the proxy version of the survey. So then we get into the section on service satisfaction, and these are those questions that are around the types of services people are receiving, their level of satisfaction and control with their services and supports. Just a couple of points I want to make on this page. First, we do start out with that introductory text. You all in previous surveying years may have found a way to introduce this section and this question in a way that flows maybe a little bit better for you. You can absolutely use that. But we do suggest using some sort of script to really sort of begin by introducing this question, which is number 9. Are you receiving any of the following long-term services and supports paid for, at least in part, by the state, Medicaid, or Medicare? For this question, we're really trying to get the person just to start to think about those types of services and supports they receive and some of the people who maybe are helping them. This does not have to be 100% accurate, although we do want you to try and have the person be as accurate as they can in thinking about the types of services they receive. We do want you to go through this question by question. You can use any kind of state-specific information and definitions to help the person best understand these service types. Again, I mentioned when we looked at the background information section that we do have a few questions that really go in depth with the types of services and supports that people receive, and that's information that comes from their records. So if you have that information ahead of time, it might be something to glance over, and that information may help inform how you can ask this question, help the person best to understand the types of response options here. Do also want to point out that this is the first question where we have a proxy respondent box at the right-hand side. And so this can be answered by the individual, but they can also receive help from somebody else if they would like that assistance. So once we get through that list of the services and supports people may be receiving, we want to find out how people first heard about the services available. And then we get into some questions around case management. So whether people have a case manager or care coordinator, this is somebody whose job it is to help them set up and coordinate services. Again, this is a place where if you have state-specific information or terminology that's used, please use whatever is the most appropriate language around case management or care coordinator. We ask about the person's ability to get in contact with the case manager. And then at the bottom of the page, questions 15 and 16, we get into questions around the person's level of control and choice about the services and supports they receive. For these questions, can you choose or change what kind of services you get and how often you get your services? Please do note that we have a couple of yes responses here. So it's yes all services or sometimes or some services. So if the person says yes here, you might want to just follow up and find out if that's true of all services. They can always change the services or how often they get them, or if there are just some services that they're able to do that for. Then we go into some questions around direct care workers and some daily activities. So these first few questions are around ADLs and IADLs. So we start out by asking how much assistance people need with everyday activities, things like preparing meals, housework, shopping, or taking medication. Really, really important for this question 18, and then when we get to question 20, which is how much assistance with self-care do you generally need, that you do read off those examples so people understand what we mean by everyday activities versus self-care. Now, I just want to remind you all of a point made back in Module 1, which is that the person's perception here is really, really important. It's what we're looking for in with this survey. And so when you're asking questions 18 and 20, you may know or have an idea of how much, if any, assistance the individual needs with everyday activities or self-care, but we're always, always going to take the person's response here. For question 23, we start to get into the people who might be helping this person on a kind of regular basis. So whether there's anybody who helps the person at home or in the community at least once a week. And this can be any kind of help. It could really also be any person. So it can be the person's family member, a direct support staff, really anybody who's supporting the person at least once a week. And then question 24 gets really specifically into who that person is. I just want to note here, if the person says that they have help from either a family member or friend, you do want to follow up and find out whether that person is paid or unpaid. And then question 25 is who else provides assistance when you need help. So question 24 is about the primary person who provides support. Question 25 is all the other people in the individual's life who may be providing support. So these next set of questions are about the people who are paid to support the individual. If the person does not have paid support workers, paid family members, or paid friends, you just skip right on over to question 33. If the person does have paid support and a person who is paid to support the individual is present at the meeting, you're going to see if you can have them leave the room or step out of the room for the set of questions. If that does not happen, so if there are paid support who are present at the meeting and for any reason are not going to leave for this part of the survey, you would go ahead and again just skip over to question 33. For everybody else, we go ahead and ask these questions about paid support. These really have not changed from previous years, so we won't go very in-depth with them, but they are those questions really around respect and choice and control as it pertains to direct care workers and those who support others who are paid to support the individual. The next few questions are those around physical environment, so modifications and changes people may have made to their home. Again, this is that one it can be a little bit tricky because it's just a little bit different from how we would ask other questions in the survey. So for this, you read through the list of the types of modifications we ask about. You want to know if the person has any of these modifications. If so, we want to find out if it's working well for them. And if not, we want to find out if the person feels that they need one to better be able to move around their home. So let's take a look at this question being asked well in the field.
Now this is about your physical environment. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you about things that are in the home that helps you to maneuver the home. Okay. So like any changes to the house. Are there any grab bars either in the bathroom or somewhere that like you can assist you like getting in and out of the tub? Yeah. In the bathroom? Okay. And does it need replacement? Does it work very well for you? Yeah. Okay. Are there any other bathroom modifications? No. Okay. So you don't need anything else in the bathroom for that? Okay. Do you have a specialized bed? Yeah. Does it it's like one of those hospital beds or it's just a regular bed? Regular bed? Is it working very well for you? Yeah. Okay. It doesn't need any replacement or anything?
So that again is a good way to go ahead and ask these physical environment questions. So we're going to take a pause here and then jump into questions around safety, security, and privacy in the upcoming module. Thanks so much for listening.